Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villery.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.
Hello, Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, crime and the weather both showed their suddenness and their fury this week, leaving lives ruined and neighborhoods battered. We'll look tonight at the effect of a surprisingly strong tornado and a brutal hijacking. We'll also hear about a report on climate change and why our area could possibly be referred to as the Big Risky. And in this, the centennial year of WWL radio, we'll hear about the station's historic role in news coverage and, as proved true this week, as a source of emergency information. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources: Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources; LeBron Joseph, news anchor and reporter, WGNO TV, Channel 26; Bob Marshall, environmental journalist and columnist for The-Times-Picayune, The New Orleans Advocate; and Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. Let's go on over to LeBron first. And you were there on scene in Araby for the strong tornado, and that's where it really hit hard.
Yeah, after getting a text, a one-word text from Parish President Guy McGinnis, and my question was, "Hey Guy, are you guys all right down there?" And his reply to me about 10 or 15 minutes later was no, and that was it. It wasn't anything else, and so we were on our way fairly quickly. EF3, 165 mile an hour maximum winds. And the area, on the one hand, is not a huge area. When you talk about damage from things like our hurricanes and things of that nature, about 11 miles, but only about 320 yards wide. So I guess a block and a half, and you can see it from all of the aerials, how it just cuts straight through there, basically from the Mississippi River all the way to that back levee off of Center Street, or the bigger damage on that side would have been on Rose Street on the side to the east. First things first, I mean, St. Bernard Parish has certainly endured its share of tragedies and weather events and all that. Going back to Hurricane Betsy and even prior to that, you know, you certainly had the Katrina wallop there, and even some Hurricane Ida damage, some of the folks we talked to. I just fixed my house after Hurricane Ida, but resilient nonetheless. And I don't think I heard anyone say, "Hey, we've got to move," or "We're getting out of here," or whatever. This is their home. They love it. And it is what it is. Weather events are part of what we live with these days. There unfortunately was one killed in the storm, a young man, several injuries. But looking at the damage down in St. Bernard, it's a very, very interesting deal. The historic side right off of St. Bernard Highway, which would have been Friscoville, to these newer homes, many of them newer homes that have been built in the last couple of years, right off of Judge Perez Drive, along Rose Street, and some of those streets back there off of Center. It was dramatic. It's a feast or famine. It's either, a couple of shingles blew off, or, half of the house is gone, or the roof is off. Some of the more dramatic pictures, a house in the middle of the street that had blown away. And according to some of the reports, a woman that lived in the house was on some medical equipment as well. I do know in that particular house, there was a wheelchair that was still on. In other words, the display was still on 10 o'clock that night or whatever. But a lot of neighbors helping neighbors too. And this was the immediate reaction of all of these people. When we got down there, they were all in the street. They were all walking down the street. It reminded me an awful lot of the rare tornado we saw on Chef Highway just a couple of years ago. We arrived right after this thing hits, and you smell natural gas, and there was a lot of that down in St. Bernard, but there was also the Atmos crews on the scene immediately, searching house to house to house, to see where, in fact, the gas leaks were coming from and things of that nature.
Now, you know, we knew that we were facing a serious weather system.
Yep.
But still, I mean, the size of this tornado was just amazing to us all because we're not
Yes.
used to seeing tornadoes like that. But even
Yes.
the fact that we had tornadoes, I mean, everybody just kind of seemed to kind of settle back thinking maybe we weren't going to get it, and then bam, the alert started coming in.
A number of the meteorologists all admitted that the storm certainly possessed the power of what was happening in Texas, and they knew that the front was going to be that. They also admitted that it was kind of early in the season for us to get that level of alert, the 3 or the 4 or whatever, for the New Orleans area. In the hours leading up to it, I was co-anchoring with Kurt this week. In the hours leading up to it, our meteorologist, Hank Allen, had even said, you know, it's interesting, we can't let our guards down, but this appears to have gotten a bit weaker as it's got, you know, across the Louisiana line. It was, you know, basically at Baton Rouge or just leaving that part, and hadn't seen any tornadoes by that time, and figuring that, hey, by the time it gets to us, maybe we're in pretty good shape. But, you know, I think the telltale sign was that every station by 6:30 or 7 o'clock had broken back into programming and was saying, hey guys, we got something on our hands. And by this point, it probably hadn't even crossed the Mississippi River. It was still on the West Bank, and there was some circulation that we were able to see.
Well, I'd like to ask Bob Marshall. Bob,
Yes.
you know, there seems to be good evidence that global warming affects the number of hurricanes and the intensity. Is there any evidence about global warming in tornadoes? Because people could be wondering that.
Well, meteorologists have said that there is definitely a link because the more warm, moist air you have in the atmosphere, the more likely you are going to have higher wind shear and the types of wind shear in these storms that can lead to tornadoes. That's what's going to happen as we go forward. There's also evidence that we're having more tornadoes, the country is, in the southeastern part of the country due to this warming weather. And of course, later in the year, we had serious tornadoes in the southeast in December. There are so many different factors that have to combine for tornadoes, which are rare events, that there's no research finished yet that can definitively link like an increase in tornadoes. In fact, there's some that shows that there may be fewer tornadoes, but maybe more severe. So the warm air we're getting, the warmer the air we're getting, the more moisture leads to the updrafts, which can result in one of the key ingredients to a tornado and a thunderstorm, and that's wind shear.
All right, thanks, Bob. And LeBron, real quickly, back to you. I mean, we should note that this tornado, as you noted, as you did say, it went 11 miles, 11 and a half miles. And so there was some damage on the West Bank and communities
Yes.
and New Orleans East, too.
There was some damage on the West Bank. There was some damage in New Orleans East. There was some roof damage on both of those. No question, there was some tree damage as well. But no question, the epicenter of the real damage was certainly what happened down in Araby. And quite interestingly, though, a number of things have sort of the governor toured, and you know he sort of gave some remarks with his precaution, if you will, saying that we don't know, and it's still not clear whether or not we will get federal dollars or the federal help because the level of damage may not rise to where it needs to be for the threshold. But I will say the parish and even Lower Ninth Ward and all that, and going there, everything was dark. I mean, pitch black throughout Orleans, that side of Orleans and St. Bernard. But by the next day, the lights were back in Lower Ninth Ward along Jackson Barracks, the whole nine, and the remainder of St. Bernard Parish. And the power crews out there, even yesterday, 6 or 7 trucks deep, trying to restore as much power as they possibly could for people that could get power. Because
Some houses can't because they're just so destroyed.
That is correct, and those houses also had their gas meters removed because they just don't want to take the chance there.
Okay, what a situation. Thanks a lot, LeBron.
Sure.
Okay, Dave, let's go on over to you. And the other big horrendous story this week, of course, was the fatal carjacking. People are just heartsick.
Yeah, you know, we've been talking now about the 300+% increase in carjackings, and it almost felt like we had become kind of numb to it, that, okay, carjackings every day, that's a part of life. And in most cases, it was the crime's committed, the car is stolen, the carjackers flee, and it's recovered a few hours later, not far away. This one was different. The 73-year-old victim, a woman who was working at an insurance agency, was in her vehicle, and the four people approached her car and told her to get out. And by all indications, that's exactly what she was trying to do. She was giving up her car, she was complying, but her arm got stuck in the seatbelt. And they took off while her arm was still stuck, the seatbelt wrapped around it, and they dragged her hundreds of feet until her arm ripped off of her body. And she fell, and the coroner now tells us she hit her head so hard that probably killed her from the blunt force trauma of hitting her head, which may be just a tiny blessing in all of this, that at least she didn't bear the pain of bleeding to death with her arm ripped off. And it was an unusual reaction, though, from the community. Typically, no one comes forward. Witnesses don't say anything. People who know the suspects keep quiet. And that's been a big problem for the NOPD, is the you don't tell the cops anything mentality that we've seen surrounding a lot of these crimes. This one was different. Witnesses came out quickly and provided information to police. The video was found almost immediately of the suspects walking toward the crime scene and was released and proliferated over television, over websites, and within hours, two of the perpetrators' parents contacted police to turn them in, a 17-year-old male and a 15-year-old girl. Both their parents called to say, we're bringing them in. That hasn't happened in a long, long time in New Orleans.
Right.
And I think they knew, once that video was out there, that there was going to be an apprehension, and I think they wanted to protect their children from a worse outcome. And when they went to arrest the 17-year-old whose parents told them where he was, a 16-year-old girl who allegedly also committed the carjacking was with him, and then a 15-year-old girl, a second 15-year-old girl, turned herself in overnight. So within just a matter of a few hours, this horrific crime occurred, the video was disseminated, tips came in, and 4 arrests were made.
4 juveniles also, 17, 16, 2, 15.
3 of them girls, 1 of them a boy.
1 of them a boy. It's just awful to see that video. Of course, we're hearing calls for these 4 juveniles to be ultimately tried as adults. What are we hearing about?
Well, if they're not tried as adults, the maximum they'll serve in juvenile detention is till their 18th birthdays. So the police chief, without any hesitation, said absolutely he's asking the district attorney to prosecute them as adults. The DA's office has yet to say what they will do in this case. You'll remember that when he ran for district attorney, Jason Williams said he would never prosecute a juvenile as an adult. That was part of his platform on his juvenile justice reform platform on which he ran. That changed early in his term because he learned, he tells us, that adults were recruiting children to commit crimes for them, including murders, because they would tell them, hey, you're not going to be prosecuted as an adult. The maximum you'll do is till your 18th birthday. We'll take care of your mom and them while you're in juvenile lockup, and we'll take care of you when you get out. As a result, Jason Williams had to go back on that campaign promise not to prosecute juveniles as adults. He has, in cases now, done that, and we don't know yet. His office has not said whether or not they'll prosecute in this case. What we do know is all 4 suspects remain locked up. They had a preliminary hearing, and a bond hearing was postponed until May. So at least until May, they are to stay in the juvenile lockup, at which time they'll have another hearing. So the DA has a significant amount of time now, a month and a half or so, to decide if he wants to move forward prosecuting them as adults. Right now, they're charged with second-degree murder. In adult court, that's life without the possibility of probation or parole. That means that if they're charged and convicted as adults, they will never see the light of day again. They will be locked up for the rest of their lives. If they're charged as juveniles, they'll be out around their 18th birthdays.
Quick, David, what do we know about the records, if there are any records on these 4?
Yeah, juvenile records are sealed, but we did learn that the 17-year-old male had been arrested at least once before for an aggravated burglary, breaking into a home and burglarizing that home. The district attorney's office acknowledged they dropped those charges and did not seek prosecution because it was a family member's home that the 17-year-old had broken into, and the family member refused to cooperate with the prosecution and would not testify.
Dave, from previous talk we've had about carjacking, one common denominator seems to be that they're not doing it to make money or to go to a chop shop or anything. They're doing this to be doing it, to go for a joyride, and that's it. Does that still seem to be the case with carjackings?
It really does. It seems that they're like playing a video game in real life. They're just going out there and doing it because they either have nothing better to do or because they enjoy it. In some cases, they'll carjack one car, then they'll go use that car to break into other vehicles, looking for guns and money and things like that. So there is some profit element to it for some of these juveniles, but by and large, it doesn't look like that's the chief motivating factor.
Right, and in this instance, the woman's car was found shortly thereafter, really not too long thereafter.
Yeah, just like in the vast majority of cases.
All righty, Dave, thanks a lot. Let's go on over to Bob right now. And you wrote a column recently, a piece about a report that had come out that basically is really grim news for Louisiana. No other way to put it.
Well, it is. It's the latest IPCC report on impacts of climate change going forward, and they put the forecast, the projections out for each section of the country. And of course, they looked at the southeast, and then Mark Schlesing, my colleague at the Times-Picayune, dug a little bit deeper, talking to scientists familiar with the report, some here in Louisiana, to ask just exactly what this report had in store for us till 2050, which of course is less than 30 years away. And it kind of piggybacked on what we already know is happening because of climate change, as the oceans have been warming due to the warming atmosphere. Sea levels are rising. We have more moisture in the air, more surface temperature in the Gulf, so we're having larger hurricanes jumping from Cat 1 to Cat 4 in 24 hours. We've had a few of those here in the last couple of years. We also have more horrendous rainfalls. We've had record floods in Baton Rouge and in St. Tammany Parish and New Orleans, creating a lot of property damage. We've had those rainfalls all across the southeastern part of the state. We've had minor hurricanes, Category 1, not to mention the Category 3 and 4 we've had, that pushed higher, more powerful storm surges because there's more water in the ocean and they're behind higher winds. So these storm surges now routinely, even for smaller hurricanes, flood the North Shore, reach up to Laplace and Houma and places like that. So we're in this predicament here we've always been in, and we've always faced more risk due to these threats because we live on this landscape that's sinking at one of the highest rates of any large coastal landscape on the planet, according to NOAA. So this report looks forward and says, well, you know, the world is not reducing emissions fast enough. And so all these impacts that we know are happening, that we're measuring today from climate change, will continue to increase as we go forward. And so by 2050, we're looking at anywhere from at least 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise while we're sinking. And that's
not a good combination.
No, and that's why NOAA has said in the past that this southeast Louisiana will see one of the highest rates of sea level rise of any place in North America going beyond 2050. And it's another reason why the state's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has already said in an EIS they put forward for the first sediment diversion that by 2070, some of the land they've built with that project through 2050 will begin to be submerged by the rising Gulf. Of course, there are other impacts for all this, rising utility costs, higher health costs because of higher temperatures. And you know, in my column, I said that, you know, we're used to living here in the Big Easy. Anyone who lives here knows that hasn't been quite that easy in the last decade.
No, it hasn't.
Every time we have to evacuate for even minor storms now. But this pretty much puts it beyond just being a pain in the butt, if you will, just an inconvenience. And in fact, these scientists, very familiar with this area, some who live here, all who are very familiar with the climatology said that this latest report basically says that there's an existential threat to communities continuing to exist here, certainly by 2050, and that means it just will be unaffordable and unlivable.
And that's referring to Southeast Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. If emissions are not cut back, the city of New Orleans really could be an island.
Well, you know, we're surrounded by 22-foot levees, so yes, in the worst case scenarios, beginning certainly by 2050 going forward to the end of the century, when sea level rise, which can't be stopped, if it continues to accelerate because of no cutback in emissions, you could be looking at 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Wow. And yes, that would flood most of the roads leading to New Orleans. So it's a pretty grim picture, and people need to understand this isn't going to be any easier. It's going to be much riskier.
So
how do we fix
risky.
it? How do we fix
Is what
that
you-
if we
you
don't get
termed it
China
in
and
the
India and nations like that around the globe who are far worse polluters than we are on board?
Well, first of all, this country is responsible for 20% of the emissions that brought the problem to this point, far more than any other country in the world. And we are working, the nation's trying to work, the administration, to encourage these other countries, mainly China, which is now the world's largest producer of emissions. But China is moving in that direction. I think they already have released a plan to get to net zero by 2050. And I think 2 weeks ago, they announced the building of the world's largest solar field, basically turning the Gobi Desert into a solar energy producer. It's in their best interest to move, but so what do we say? We're not going to do anything if you don't do anything? And they are doing stuff.
Okay, and the governor also has a climate action plan.
Exactly.
And of course, we have our master plan for the coast. Okay, Bob, thanks a lot, I guess. It wasn't the greatest news.
Yeah.
Okay, but something that is really nice. Let's go on over first to E. 100th anniversary for WWL radio. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I want to go to Dave to talk about the impact that WWL had on news, but just to mention, in the old days, that WWL, before you had television, its role was different. It used to do the kind of programming that TV would later start doing and radio would back out of. But I know that my father, when he traveled, always carried a radio, and wherever he stayed, he turned the radio on that night to listen to the big band music from WWL, from the Blue Room at the Roosevelt Hotel. And it was really exciting to hear the announcer say, and now live from New Orleans from Roosevelt Hotel, and he had a band of like Leon Kellner. And so WWL played more of a national role, as did 50,000 watt stations. The 50,000 watt stations were allowed at the time when there were few radio stations, so they wanted the stations that they had to reach across the nation. And they had more variety shows like the Dawn Buster show and that sort of thing. With the evolution of TV, you saw radio take on a different role, that you didn't need the big variety shows on radio anymore. And ultimately you saw what it is today, which is primarily news and talk and sports. And it's a good combination. And at that, I want to turn over to Dave and talk about some of the historic role that WWL has had with news.
You know, being a 50,000 watt station on a clear signal comes with responsibilities from the federal government as well. Those stations, WWL in particular, is licensed without any interference from any stations in the country, so that in the event of a national emergency or a regional emergency, that radio can be used to reach everybody. And that is still the case today. You know, we think back no further than Hurricane Katrina. There was no other form of communication. There were no cell phones. There were no telephones. There was no television. No one was throwing newspapers. The internet was not working. Nothing was working in Southeast Louisiana for communications except for WWL radio. And in fact, in a historic move, our competitors in the market turned our signal on and evacuated, because even they knew that under no circumstances would we go off the air. And we take that responsibility very seriously. And it's because of what happened 100 years ago in a physics lab at Loyola University as an experiment and a fundraiser. The first broadcast on WWL was an effort to raise money for Loyola University. The Jesuits saw it as an opportunity to ask people to donate. And that's how it started on the very first broadcast. And it evolved into what Errol was talking about in terms of being people gathering around the radio for entertainment in its infancy. And as it evolved, you're right, it's become so much more focused now on information, news, sports, weather, traffic, all of those things. And we take the responsibility very seriously that we have backups for all of our studios in terms of power providing, in terms of backups on getting our signal out. All of our transmitters have multiple generator backups, both natural gas and diesel, because we know that when things go badly, we have to be there when it matters, and take that responsibility very seriously. And we're very proud of the fact that we've done it now for, well, most of 100 years after that initial fundraising role.
Definitely say, you know, the station is a lifeline to us during these emergency situations. We know it's there, and we can reach it. And I know I've spent many a night with my little transistor radio, listening to WWL radio, telling me what's going on. I mean, after Katrina, you guys were really such a source of information and help to us all.
And that clear signal really made a difference. We heard from people, you know, at night we reached 36 states just on the AM signal. And we heard from people who were evacuated all over the nation that they'd go out to their cars at night and sit and listen. So our prime time, we put our biggest efforts overnight after Katrina to let people know what was happening, because nobody was here, everybody had evacuated. So we knew we were broadcasting to people who were scattered all over the country. We know we got to be there in the bad times. We like to be there in the good times too. When the Saints win a Super Bowl, for example. You heard that on WWL.
And we like listening to you, so happy 100th. We wish you 100 more, that's for sure. Other stories now. E, quick.
Well, speaking of solar, the city announced today a solar initiative, a city-sponsored project to establish solar gardens around the city. Some would be like on rooftops that people can tap into. 41 states have it. New Orleans will be the first place in the South to have it.
Very good. LeBron.
Well, we've been blessed with great weather. We've been talking a whole lot about weather in this show, but great weather for the past couple of big events, and this weekend is another big one. The Jazz and Heritage folks are doing their Treme Gumbo Fest and all over in Armstrong Park.
Beautiful weekend coming up. Bob?
Yeah, maybe the wind will calm down so some of us can get out and fish a little bit.
I agree.
All right, then Dave, let's have you wrap it up.
Well, Buku Fest is this weekend, and while that's not as large a festival and isn't as cross-generational as some of the other festivals, for the tourism officials, it kicks off a huge season for us now, from Buku to French Quarter Fest into Jazz Fest, and we haven't had those festivals for 3 years now, so it's the first time in 3 years they're all back.
We're ready for them. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, too. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
Informed Sources is made possible in part by Susie and Pierre G. Villeray.
With a lifetime of passion for public television, we are pleased to help underwrite Informed Sources.
Please join us in supporting WYES TV.